And thank you again for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Racine Harris.
Thank you so much, Marian. Hello, All Rise. Good to see and meet all of you virtually. I'm Racine Harris. I'm a product manager at Slack, where I'm primarily responsible for the search experience and helping you find the information you need to get your work done. I'm really excited to be here today for one of the first one-on-one conversations that's hosted by Allraise. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by Joe Zadeh, who's formerly the head of Airbnb experiences. He's here today to share with us his experience in journeying with the company from its very early days through the launch of new product lines and everything in between. So if you all could please join me in welcoming Joe.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I really appreciate the time and space to share.
Sweet. You have so much that you can share with us today, but I want to start kind of with your journey. You have an academic background in bioengineering. You have a PhD in bioengineering, and you started working in tech as a software engineer, and you moved into product once you got to Airbnb. I'd love to hear about how you got to product when you had been working on bioengineering.
Well, I mean, so maybe I'll start at the very beginning. I grew up in Southern California, but my parents were Iranian immigrants. So they immigrated from Iran, maybe the early 70s, and they were entrepreneurs. And like a lot of immigrant entrepreneur families, the whole family gets involved in the enterprise. And so I was building a lot of their computer systems when I was still like in high school and pretty young. I got so into it that I decided to get an undergrad degree in computer science. And then, that was around the time of the Human Genome Project. And I got really excited about, how do computers and biology work well together? And so I decided to get a PhD. So I went to Caltech to get a PhD in bioengineering. And, a lot of my research was developing, computer algorithms for designing biomolecules. But the other half of my PhD was making a consumer app that made the science easy to use. And I realized as I did it more and more that I liked the consumer side more than the science side. So when I finished my PhD, I decided that I would join a startup. I was briefly at Mint.com as they were acquired by Intuit. I didn't really want to work for a big company. And so I ended up joining Airbnb as the third software engineer, ninth employee, when they were still working out of an apartment. And I knew I wanted to be in product, but I joined as an engineer because I thought I would learn more about products sitting next to two designers, Joe and Brian, in the same bedroom of this apartment than I would if I was like at Google, super deep in the stack. And, so I wanted to learn more about design. And then, after about a year of being an engineer, I started to notice that I wasn't doing engineering work anymore. I was doing product management. So we didn't have product managers at the time. And so I talked to the founders, and they said, okay, why don't you run product for trust and safety? And then a few weeks later, we had our first major PR crisis where someone's home got ransacked. And I led the entire product organization through shipping features for safety. And they just asked, okay, well, why don't, after that, why don't you just stay on and run day-to-day of product? And I did that for several years, built our product management function to about 70 product managers. And then at that point, Airbnb shifted into business units. And one really common career path for product managers is to become a GM. And so I helped create and invent Airbnb experiences, and then I ran the business for about 3 years. And then started winding down just as COVID hit and my successor took over. And then I left Airbnb a few months ago.
Very cool. Quite the journey. One thing you pointed out was that you started, your first job was at Mint, and it was being acquired by Intuit at the time, and you realized that wasn't you didn't want to work for a big company like Intuit. You were Airbnb's 9th hire, and you stayed for several years and built a career there. Literally watched this company grow from near inception to IPO. So before we get into more specific questions, what was it about Airbnb that made it a company that you wanted to grow and a place where you wanted to grow your career?
Yeah, let's start with why you even joined Airbnb. Back then, I remember having that conversation with my parents. I'm like, I was just working on biotechnology, but now I'm going to go help, strangers sleep with each other. And they could not understand it. Most people could not understand why Airbnb would be successful or why it was a good idea. But I had this kind of insight that most people didn't, in that I was a very active couch surfer. So when I was in grad school, you don't get paid very well. And when I would travel, I would, sleep on people's floors for free or stay in hostels, and I was having the time of my life. And I remember one time, after like spending 4 days on someone's floor, leaving and being super sad about it. And I was like, when I turn I was my 20s at the time, I'm in my 30s, I'm not going to be able to sleep on people's floors. I'm not going to bring my kids with me to go sleep on someone's floor. Like, that form of travel would go away for me. And I felt very sad about it. And when I discovered Airbnb, it's like, oh, well, this is great. I can do this for the rest of my life. And it actually solved some of the problems that existed with couch surfing. Like, I would wait for 2 hours for someone to pick me up. Well, that's not going to happen when you're actually paying for a service or paying for a certain level of quality. And so it was really easy for me to understand it. And once I started to understand that the host side can be very beneficial for hosts, and people were saving their homes, after the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, it just made a lot of sense. And then, I mentioned that the two of the founders were designers. I really gravitated towards that. And I started to discover that it was a place where I could bring my full self to work. I'd always been a scientist and engineer, but kind of a bit of like an artist in a scientist's body. And that was celebrated at Airbnb. And I felt like it was a place where, we really married technology and art together. And I was very passionate about that. And, I was also lucky enough to get, ongoing opportunities to continue growing. And that kept me extremely engaged for a decade.
That's awesome. And I think it just looking throughout your career journey, it really paid off, those investments there in your career. I do want to take a quick pivot. We have a lot of founders in the audience and also some operators. And so one thing that everybody talks about is product market fit, and the journey about discovering product market fit. And I think you were at Airbnb before y'all had fully launched. So I wanted to start by asking you, how do you think about, or how do you define product market fit? And what do you think are the key mindsets and skills needed for the journey of finding that?
Yeah, this question would come up a lot when I was running Airbnb experiences. And, I would hear it in a lot of meetings. Do we have product market fit? I think we do. No, I don't think we have product market fit. And what I struggled with that question is that it's phrased in a very, it can be phrased in a very binary way. And the reality is that I think of product market fit as a continuum, as different phases or different milestones. When Airbnb was valued at reportedly valued at $1 billion in 2011, I think I would struggle to tell you that we had strong product market fit, even though the company was valued so high, because the vast majority of travelers still hadn't heard about it. The vast majority of travelers wouldn't use it. My parents were afraid to use it. So what does product market fit really mean in that case? So I think of it as a continuum in phases. And you can definitely tell when you don't have product market fit. In other words, you have zero traction. So when we originally launched Airbnb experiences, they were 2 to 3 day experiences. You would go hang out with someone who made perfume in Paris for 3 days, a couple hours every day. It cost $200, and we did not see very much traction with that. And people didn't really want to commit to that much time. People like perfume, but maybe not that much to want to spend 3 days of their Paris journey doing that. And so we quickly pivoted to short experiences, and they grew extremely quickly. We scaled to 1,000 cities really quickly. But then you start asking, okay, what's that next layer of product market fit, that next layer of product market fit? And I think the mindset that you need to have is one of a curious scientist. At every stage, no matter whether you're a Fortune 500 company or you're a seed stage company, just have to be asking, how does this product resonate with consumers? And if it's resonating, why is it resonating? If it's not resonating, why? But always asking the question, why, so that you can continue to iterate and make it better, and never see, I'm sure any travel company that thought they had ultimately reached product market fit found themselves in a bit of a pickle when the pandemic happened, right? So you have to always be on your toes, ready to evolve and understand how the consumer is changing. So I think it's better to think about it more as a spectrum than it is black and white.
What kind of things did you use to, you said when you first launched experiences, they were just too burdensome. There was a lot, and you weren't getting a lot of traction because it didn't attract enough people, frankly. But you didn't scrap the idea of experiences. You said, okay, how can we make this something that people will pay for and will actually enjoy, and we can scale it? What went into that decision, and how did you come to the decision to just not leave this idea totally, but like to refine it?
Yeah, I think one of the things, as a side note on product market fit, is like, oftentimes you can see the glimpse of the future product by how your existing consumers are breaking it. So, I had seen examples of experiences that hosts were already offering. We had seen them. We knew it was a good idea. We had tried it ourselves. Just like in the early days, the whole premise for Airbnb was because the founders, they witnessed how amazing it could be if done well. And so we knew we had something. I actually believe that Paris idea, that the perfume experience for 3 days, that can be successful one day, but you have to work your way to something simpler to start. And so we thought we had the avenue to simplify, to pare it back, to try something that was a little bit more accessible, and then work our way over time to something that was a bit more immersive. And I think that the fact that we had proof points that existed on the platform before we started, I think gave us a bit more confidence. Like, my personal example is that my partner and I were the first people to stay on Easter Island on Airbnb. And the host, charged us, but gave us an entire day touring the island. He grew up there, and it was one of the best travel experiences I ever had. And so even personally, I felt that. And then I also felt when we had launched our 3-day experiences, 2-day experiences, I was struggling myself to actually use the product. Like, I couldn't find the time to do that. I didn't want to subject my partner to, when we travel, to do that. And so, when you're struggling to use your own product, that's also a good sign that, maybe we need to make some adjustments to it.
One question some folks in the audience had was, what are the frameworks that you might recommend for deciding what to build next as folks are going from seed, series, and beyond? And another question I had was, when do you start bringing in like data versus intuition? I think we have an idea of what we want to build, and we set out and build this grand thing. And at some point, data comes in and helps inform those decisions. But like, when does that actually happen? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so one of the major tenets of the product management org that we built is this marriage of art and science. How do art and science work together? And I think another way of thinking about that is data and intuition, or vision and validation. And I think the best products of all times have some combination of both, but I think in the life cycle, you're going to shift more in one direction versus more in the other. If you are a seed stage, and especially doing something that could be considered disruptive to the status quo, there's not much data to inform whether or not it's a good idea. It's more intuition. If you are in hypergrowth and you're becoming mainstream, you're probably running tons of A/B tests and getting tons and tons of data and tons of research groups, and you have that luxury to do that. So I think as you go along, you do shift a bit more from intuition to data. And even on the intuition side, you can start with that vision, but you have to validate it with your consumers. But at all times, there's always a combination of both. And the company I always use an example that does a great job of this is Pixar. They tell really beautiful artistic stories, but they bring it to life with technology. And I think that that's kind of always been a mental image for me on how great products are made. It's like you have this great vision, you have to validate it quickly, and you have to pay attention that when the data comes back and says, hey, people don't want to do 3-day experiences, you have to be that curious scientist and be like, okay, why? How can I improve the product and change it?
I love that. I think sometimes we have to challenge our own assumptions. We love our babies, right? We love the thing that we thought of, and we work really hard to put it out. And it can be, you can choose to listen to all of the data or the data that reinforces what you think. And I think you do have to be very critical of the things that you put out to say, okay, how is it being received? And if it isn't being received with all of the glory that I had for it, why is that? And how can I either make it better or do something that is actually meeting the need of users? So I really like that.
Yeah, and
what do you think?
Go for it. A challenge for founders, right? I mean, that what's so great about founders is this persistence to a vision that others can't see, but you have to find that balance about, okay, when is this vision maybe too soon or just not quite going to work, or how do I kind of bridge the gap. And I think that, I think some founders do struggle with that, but if you can find that balance of holding your vision and being willing to evolve it, I think it's very powerful.
What do you think founders, how can they be better at that? Who do they need around them? Because I think if you only are checking in with yourself about it, it's very hard to come to the point where you're willing to be, more humble and let what's happening actually lead you. So how should founders think about creating a sounding board or a board of advisors for themselves as they're journeying through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had like a magic wand, but I mean, it really just comes down to like being open to hearing that things aren't going the way that you wanted, and to be and to almost have some level of distance from it, and not get so caught up that your vision and your personal identity become the same thing, but to have a little bit of distance. And that's why I kind of used that analogy earlier of the curious scientist. Like you can, as a scientist, you have hypotheses that as a human you want to really be true, but you have, as a scientist, you also have to like really look as objectively as possible about whether or not this thing is resonating. And then sometimes you might have to say, I know the data's saying one thing, but I still really believe it. Yeah. I'm going to keep pushing on it and see what happens. I mean, the majority of investors early on were just like, no way, we're not investing in Airbnb. And it wasn't until Airbnb entered YC and got some really good mentorship and started proving that they could be profitable, then people started to notice. So it is a very fine balance, but I think being able to sit with the uncomfortable news that your baby is not like working the way you want it to, I think that will go a long way.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest decisions that you think impacted Airbnb's product trajectory?
And this kind of goes back to the idea that it's a spectrum and things are always evolving. When Airbnb launched, or the first time they ever had an Airbnb, was the founders inflating air mattresses on their floor for a design conference, and they served breakfast. And at first they're like, okay, all Airbnbs will have air mattresses and will serve breakfast. And they started, people have been like, well, I have this extra room with a bed. Can I just like sleep in the bed? And then eventually, I think if I have my story straight, I think Barry Manilow's drummer wanted to rent his entire home out when he traveled, but our platform didn't allow it. And so we're like, oh, well, that's not hard. Let's just open up the platform and let people do it, entire places. And originally we also didn't have a payment system. You had to exchange payment in person, which was very awkward. And so we put a payment system in place, but that also made way for a business model and the ability to take a service fee. And that was major. And then I think, a lot of that stuff was right before I joined. When I joined, was at this nexus of the web world and the mobile world. And pretty soon after, maybe a couple of years after I joined, I started to think more and more, people, it's not super compatible to reach out to a lot of hosts who are across the world and wait 24 hours for a response about whether or not I can book this place in a world where Uber was doing, promotions where you can have a kitten delivered to your office that you can pet it or something like that. Yep. Just these two things are not compatible. And so we moved a lot of our hosts to Instant Book. And that's something that I personally led the company through. And that shift of, getting hosts comfortable renting their place to people without having that initial conversation. And, it ended up being, in my opinion, something that really helped us shift more into the mobile era. And that was maybe another big one. And of course, one of the biggest product shifts, which I would say Airbnb is still going through, is moving from a single platform for renting a home to now a travel platform that can do multiple things. And so that can now offer experiences. And going from one product that's, all the payment systems are designed around homes, all of the, trust and safety systems are designed around homes, all of a sudden moving to like, how does search work when you have multiple product types? That is a very tough transition, especially for, what is still a very, very big business. And I think, that's something that a lot of companies have to go through.
What went into the decision of like being willing to take the bet on becoming a bigger travel platform? Or was that always the plan? When Airbnb was founded, was it that it was going to be this huge travel platform that would completely change the way a lot of us travel, myself included. And I will say, thank you for Instant Book. It does make a difference. I appreciate it. But what went into that decision to be like, we're not just going to be a room with a mattress and breakfast, to say like, we're going to be a room, we're going to be a house, we're going to be an experience, we're going to be an online experience? Like, what went into that decision?
Yeah, in 2011, we, the founders and a few of us, like we went on a little offsite and we were just discussing the future of the company. And there was lots of different ideas about where Airbnb could go. You know, the idea was, listen, we know we're going to be great at home sharing. What else can we do? And I think, you know, the underlying premise of that is that, you know, companies need to continuously be innovating. And, you know, one of our board members has a blog post, Jeff Jordan has a blog post called Layers of the Cake. You know, you have to continuously be adding layers to your business. And so we were thinking about, okay, what are the future layers of the cake that we want to add? And, you know, some people thought, okay, we should get into car sharing because we already do home sharing. Car sharing is the next obvious thing. I was like, maybe we should do drill sharing because drills only get 13 minutes of use in their entire life. Why does everybody own their own drill? Or, you know, as an example for sharing almost anything.
Yeah.
And then, you know, Brian Chesky went on the holiday break and came back having, you know, reread the Disney biography about how Walt Disney used storyboards to make Snow White. He's like, well, why don't we storyboard an entire trip? And once we storyboarded, we actually hired a Pixar storyboard artist to do it for us. And we looked at it like, you know, listen, Airbnb is an offline product, but we're only involved in this one tiny sliver. There is so much opportunity just within travel. And so then we decided that, you know, we were going to take on more, and one day, you know, take the entire, you know, try to offer all parts of the travel experience. And I think that might have been going too far. And I think we ended up having to bring it back, just say, okay, what's the next product now with the experience? But, you know, that happened pretty early on.
Do you think that there were, or maybe you can tell us if there's anything that you all tried that didn't work? And I'm sure there were, but what were the lessons? What were the lessons that you kind of learned out of those things? Did you try car sharing and realize like, yeah, we're gonna leave that to somebody else?
Yeah, we tried a bunch of stuff, including even having like partnerships where we would see in emails if, you know, people were interested in car sharing or not. You know, and I'm not sure we learned much from those kinds of things. When you do those kinds of experiments, the danger is learning the wrong information because you're not investing enough to learn it correctly. So we tried a lot of stuff. I think the biggest lesson, you know, because I'm laughing because I've a lot of things I've done have been successful, but a lot of things have also been very not successful.
Yeah.
And, you know, the common thread that I learned across those two things, especially, you know, since I've left the company, I've had time to reflect. The common thread is simplicity. When you're trying to do too much at once, or your product's too complicated, or you're offering too many things too quickly, it's very hard for it to take off. And the things I'm most proud of, the launches, the products, the features that I'm most proud of, were all really easy to explain. Like, you know, Instant Book is really easy to explain why that would be useful. You know, I think when we launched experiences, we actually launched it as, we have experiences. We now have guidebooks. We have a restaurant integration with Resi. You know, one day we're going to get into flights. And that's just, we did all that and then realized we didn't have product market fit at all with experiences, which is the thing that was most close to our mission of belonging.
Right.
And so we decided, okay, we're going to scrap the rest of it for now and just focus on making experiences successful. So I think that the common thread, you'll probably hear me always say it a lot, is just simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Keep it really simple. You know, I would say that, you know, if you're a seed stage company, you probably even be thinking about multiple product lines, just getting that first product in its simplest form to have any sign of traction. And then as you have hyper growth, if you have more signs of growth, then you can start thinking through those other layers of the cake, but keep those layers really simple.
I like that. I want to shift focus a little bit because there were a few other topics that we wanted to talk on. One is scaling and hiring decisions. And a question that we had was, how does the type of team you need change as the company evolves? Obviously, you were very early on at Airbnb. But what did the team look like when y'all were establishing product market fit? And then how did that change as you all grew, and how quickly did it change?
The profile of who you hire changes as the company matures. So when we were hiring engineers, when I joined, we specifically didn't want product managers yet. We wanted engineers that had product sensibilities, which does not describe every engineer. And also, when I look at the early product managers, we were looking for people that were comfortable building the machine, not necessarily people that want to plug into the machine. And to maybe bring that to life, I remember interviewing a bunch of people from Google who had been like, career Google product managers and really excellent product managers, but they had plugged into the Google system, which was already established. And I would think may not have the exact skill sets that we needed to build something which had a lot of ambiguity, a lot of open space, no rules, a lot of like, systems that they had depended on, at Google don't exist yet. Mm-hmm. And what I actually found was a profile that seemed to fit better were former founders as our first PMs. And I found that either through acquisitions or through just hiring former founders, that especially people that had dealt with adversity, had a string of failures behind them, had really understood what it's like to, kind of have a blank canvas and are comfortable with that. And I found that at first that was a much better profile. I think as the company matures, we want to move more from, generalists to people that are a bit more specific in their needs. And I think, more of those systems get built out, and then I think that profile fits a bit better.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think you answered a question that I had selfishly, was like, what did your first product hires look like? But I think based on how you described what it was that you were looking for, you needed people who could really just come in and say, like, we're building a ship and we're kind of building it as we're going. So are you down with that, or do you need a full ship to be built and you can work on some of the pieces of the ship, right? One thing I'm also curious to, go for it.
I said I would be remiss not to give a shout out to Laura Terhayden, who was on the call I saw earlier.
I see.
She was my recruiting partner and so much more in terms of almost a mentor to me. And a lot of credit to building the product management org from 1 to 70, really goes to her and her partnership. Thank you, Laura.
That's awesome. I'm curious about how you aligned product strategy at Airbnb as it grew over time. I'm a product manager. I'm in a non-huge company, but I've sat in a couple of different companies and seen how product strategy kind of gets rolled out in different ways. And I'm curious what was your approach to keeping everybody aligned on what we're working on, what we're focusing on, what we're ruthlessly going to make really great for our customers, when I'm sure there's lots of other things you could imagine, right? So how did you keep everybody aligned?
I think the most important principle is to make sure that the product strategy and the company strategy are in lockstep. And I know that might sound obvious, but I've mentored some senior product leaders, and I'm surprised like they don't actually know what's on the CEO's mind, or the CEO's in a different direction. They think something else is important. I think one of the most important things is to make sure that can the executive system align on a very simple strategy for the entire company, and then how does a product roadmap and product strategy ladder up to that? And that's by far the most important thing. And everything else, becomes, there's lots of different ways to run a team. I mean, we would do weekly meetings with all the major product leaders and, kind of review when we were using OKRs, we review progress in OKRs, or talk about hiring and how that's going. But I think what can be destabilizing is if the company's moving in one direction, the product organization is moving in a different direction. At some point that comes to a head, and that can be jarring, because all of a sudden you have to reconcile that, and that might mean taking people off the projects, putting them on something else, and that's just disruptive. And if you can, sometimes you can't avoid it, but when you can avoid it, it's nice.
I think that's really good. That was actually a question. I was like, so then you have to reconcile those things, and that can take all sorts of forms and shapes. I want to move on and talk about some of your like early lessons in management. Um, how do you think leadership evolves over time and as a company and individual grows?
Yeah, I think that my experience in leadership and management was I was a very deep IC as a PhD student, right? Like a PhD is an extreme IC, and then I jumped into management within a year and a half later, never having worked at a corporate environment before. And so for me personally, that was a very steep learning curve, and I'm just really grateful that I had great coaches and mentors to help me along the way. And one thing I learned over time, and I think a coach told me this, and if I could go back and tell my previous self this, it would be the way you lead yourself is how you lead others. The way you manage yourself is how you manage others. And for me, I'm a fairly self-critical, very intense worker, will sacrifice my health to get something done. And for better or worse, that will show up in how you manage others. And it sometimes led to really great results and sometimes really burn people out. And I think over time, I learned to understand that like how you lead and manage yourself really plays a big role into how your own teams help. And so I learned the value of putting time into self-care, exercise, meditation, eating well. And I found that when I sometimes decided to do something nice for myself instead of work an extra hour, I found that I got actually better results from the team because I was able to care for them better. And I think that that's one thing that I think that I wish I had understood much earlier in that journey. So if you're not managing yet, I'd recommend taking some time to like really be in touch with your own mental and physical health and kind of focus on that as a way of growing as a manager. Not just trying to read management books about how to manage people.
I really like that. That is a quote. If you're taking down quotes, you're taking notes. The way you lead yourself is how you will lead and manage other people. And I really like that. And I believe that. What was one of your biggest pitfalls in your early stages of becoming a leader and a manager? And it may have been this.
I think that was it. As I said, I came from Caltech, extremely intense environment. And a hypergrowth company is also a very intense environment, like, because you're just trying to keep up with the growth as much as you possibly can. And then, trying to learn how to manage on the job, not really having good examples of it in the past, just because of the career trajectory I was on. And so I think learning that lesson was probably the most valuable one. But I think it's also, as we talked about with product market fit, it's surrounding yourself with people that can help you. And so I was lucky, as I said, lucky enough to have mentors and coaches that helped me. I mentioned, Laura earlier. Laura was never, as my recruiting partner, never afraid to put me in my place and tell me when I was doing something wrong. And, and there's such high degrees of trust there. And it just surrounding yourself with people that can help you along that journey is really clear. But I think the inward psychology of being a manager is such a big part in how you manage others.
How do you evaluate the success of a manager, either of yourself or of a manager that you manage? Is it based on the success of the people that they manage or something else?
Yeah, I think you can look at the surface layers. You look at the what and the how, like what did they ship and what did they build and how did they do it? How does their team feel and all that? But I think one of the things that I look for with managers I look at the status, like the status and health of their team. And what do I mean by that? Like, if you only look at the results, you're looking only at lagging indicators. What you want to look at is like, how is this team going to perform 6 months from now, 1 year from now? And one of the most important decisions that you make as a manager or leader is who you put in the role, and is it the right person for the role? And more often than not, even when I was giving feedback to director level reports of mine, more often than not, the feedback was like, you have certain individuals in these roles that either are not able to meet expectations because you haven't been clear in your expectations, or they will just not be able to meet expectations in 6 months because the work is going to be too much, and it's not going to end well. And I look at that as in terms of, is the manager putting the right people in the right roles? And if it's not the right person in the right roles, how are they resolving that? Are they investing in coaching that individual, or are they having to say, listen, this is not the right role for this individual, we need to shift things around a little bit? And you want to basically train your managers to see around corners and to put the right people in the right roles. But that means that you have to help them see around corners, and hopefully use the experience you've gained to help them see, hey, this thing might come up in a couple. It might seem fine today, but it might be difficult in a couple months. And that's especially true in hyper-growth environments, is that somebody can be doing an amazing job and in 3 months be completely underwater because the growth changed so fast. The job got, there was 1 year of experiences, we had 8x growth. And that means that in a quarter, someone might be doubling in their responsibilities, but they may not be doubling in their ability to do the job. And so, so that's one of the things that makes hypergrowth management very difficult.
Got it. Thank you. A similar sort of different question is, what do you think makes an effective product leader? So not just management, but person leading product. What are the characteristics of that person? So,
we looked for a couple of things when we built the product organization. One thing that I talk a lot about is like this ability to balance art and science. Another thing we looked for in hires was growth mindset, especially in a hyper-growth environment. It's important what level of experience they bring. What's critically as important is how fast will they adapt, how fast will they learn, and when they make mistakes, how do they deal with mistakes? Do they get really upset? Do they, or do they try to learn from it? But if I was to go back in time, I would add one more thing, which I think is probably the most critical thing that a good product manager and product leader need, and that is to be a champion of simplicity. The greatest product leaders, in my opinion, are real champions of simplicity. And I think the one thing that I think people need to accept, whether or not they're leading a team of 1 or they're leading a team of 10,000, is that you will never, ever have enough resources to do everything that you want to do. And therefore, you have to be choiceful and recognize that you cannot do everything. And you have to be able to pick what is the one thing or 2 things that really matter that will move the needle, that'll get us 80% of the way there. And let's just focus on those 2 things, not try to get everything done under the sun. So I think a real, and that's really hard because a lot of times you're having to say no to so many good ideas that your team might be really emotionally attached to. And the ability to be able to do that and explain that and get your team's buy-in about why you're cutting the thing they care about, it goes a super long way.
I like that. Thank you for that. We are about 5 minutes away from getting into some questions because I see some popping up in the chat and some that were presented before. I actually want to make a really quick shift over to talking about culture. We hear it all the time about tech culture, company culture. What does that mean? People are going to companies because of culture. Why do you think culture is so important? And what does it inform in terms of values and what you work on and how you work?
Yeah, I define culture as the how. So your product strategy, the products you build, that's kind of the what. But the how is, how do people treat each other? How does the company act? How are decisions made? What's acceptable? What's not acceptable? And a company's like Airbnb, like any other company, we write our core values out, things that are really important to us. But ultimately, the culture is not what's written on a piece of paper. The culture is what are the actions that people take. What kinds of people do we hire? What kinds of decisions do we make when we do performance reviews and calibrations? How are we rewarding which kinds of decisions and which kind of people? And I think all those combine to make culture. But since I know there's so many early stage founders in the company, what I will say is that my observation is that so much of the culture comes from the founders and the founding team. When I first stepped foot in Airbnb, the apartment, I was hit with this just amazing energy. And 10 years later, I could go to any office, Airbnb office in the world, including like, we opened up an LA office for experiences, and I would step foot, and it was in a WeWork, and I would still step foot in that WeWork office and still feel that Airbnb energy. And I think that the founders did a really good job of doing that. But I will say that, like, especially since there are founders in this call, like the founder relationships will also percolate through the organization. And so I think it's really important that founders communicate really well, that they don't let their disagreements kind of flow to the rest of the organization. And I think that can tarnish the culture. Fortunately, I think Airbnb founders were really tight knit, and they were like really, really well aligned. But the couple times that they may not agree on something, well, that usually has to get ironed out with employees, and that's when you sometimes can have like cultural tension. But thankfully, the founders did a really incredible job on this.
Yeah. Something you and I talked about before was how does company culture and who you want to be as a company impact how your business is structured? So, for instance, if a company wants to be a public benefit corporation, when should that conversation happen, and how does that shape the culture in the organization that's built?
Yeah, and my last couple months of Airbnb, I worked on moving Airbnb to helping move Airbnb to be a multi-stakeholder company. And what that means is, most companies, their sole purpose is to increase shareholder value. There is a more and more these days a push for companies to be more about purpose, have a positive impact while also making profits, and being aware of multiple stakeholders. So for Airbnb, it's our hosts, it's our guests, it's our employees, it's the communities that we operate in, and it's the shareholders. And I think that, first of all, I think that's going to be more and more the norm, especially with the change of administration. And I think it's a really, really good thing. And so I think founders, no matter what kind of business you're in, you should be starting to think through what is the positive impact I can have on society, and how can I recognize, be careful of my stakeholders. I think if you were thinking about things like, should we be a public benefit corporation, which essentially legally codifies the ability to serve multiple stakeholders, I would think about that very early on. What you don't want to do is go down a trajectory over many years and then change expectations for the people who join your company or the people who invest in you, and be really upfront with the kind of company that you want to be, so that it's not as hard to make those adjustments as you go on. You won't be able to predict everything, and you'll get some of it wrong. Mm-hmm. But if you have any sort of think like, oh, maybe this should be a public benefit corporation, I think that's the kind of thing you want to think through very early. And also, it's legally very difficult to change structures once you're established. And so think of that stuff early. But that the being a public benefit corporation versus not may not make all that much difference. What's most important is like being really clear and being upfront and communicating your intentions of how you want to run the company, and that hey, we might leave this amount of profit on the table because we care about this kind of positive impact on the community, and being really upfront about that.
Awesome. I have a ton more questions. I could literally talk to you for another hour, but we are coming up on time. So I do want to take some time to just go over some of the questions that we got from the audience before, and also in chat. I see one question that has been plussed a couple of times, and this one is specifically about Airbnb and how it operated. How do you prioritize and balance the needs of the two sides of your marketplace?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I don't know if I believe that there is a single one size fits all for every business, but I think you have to think very deeply about it for your business. Even how homes and experiences work together was extremely different. We saw that you can continuously add more and more homes to the platform, and in a lot of cases, like, well, two homes in Paris might be relatively equivalent to each other, so they're good substitutes for each other. But also, if one of them doesn't get booked, well, it's that person's property anyway, and it's not like it's different than if you're trying to make money by selling your time. You're selling access to an asset versus access to a time. So the experiences, what we saw was that we would bring on a lot of experiences, but only maybe a smaller number of them would get booked. And it would maybe leave some of the other hosts that weren't getting booked kind of sometimes feel a little left out. And it could be for right of reasons. Their thing might be too esoteric or not appeal to people. And so you have to be, even then we had to be really thoughtful about how many. I think it's better to bring on fewer hosts and make them the ones you have more successful than bring on tons of people and have lots of folks be. And that was unique to experiences in a way that it was not showing up in homes. And that's just an example of how you have to make sure that you're not only balancing supply and demand, you're also being thoughtful about the supply that's not being utilized. And as I said, that behaves very differently for an Airbnb experiences than it does for an Amazon, it does for Netflix. But I just think being kind of diving into it and being thoughtful about it. And then the other thing you have to think through is how important is curation for this business? There are some marketplace businesses where curation is actually not that important. What really matters is that you have a ton of selection. And there are other businesses, I think more entertainment businesses, like, you're only going to subscribe to HBO Max if it has really the hit shows, not if it has like the super long tail of like 80s movies, right? Like you really want to make sure it has the things that people want to watch. And so I think you have to be thoughtful about what kind of business you're in. And I think entertainment, which I would put experiences as, is one of those businesses where there needs to be a higher degree of curation in order to make sure that people you have on your platform are getting utilized.
Thank you. Anna asked, I would love to know more about the launch strategy behind experiences. How did you think about curating the very first set of experience hosts?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, when we launched launch experiences, they were not quite correct. There were longer experiences, and then we moved into much shorter experiences. We had an amazing team that would go launch city by city, and they had a playbook of what they knew would do really well when a city opened. And then on top of that, we did curate every single listing. And by vet, maybe vet is a better word than curate, that we looked at every experience before it came on the platform to make sure that it met our quality standards, objectively met our quality standards. So one of the standards is around expertise. Does the experience host, are they really an expert in their field? Like doing a tea drinking experience, did they just start drinking tea last week, or have they been doing this? Are they like a green tea master and their whole life, right? And then we looked for access. If you're going to a public place anybody can go to, well, where are you adding differentiation? We wanted people that could really provide good access, and of course, human connection. I think people book for the activity, but what they love about the experience is that they connect with other people. That's hard to analyze up front, but we also looked at reviews to see how well they did on all these axes. And we would, when people didn't quite meet the quality standards, we'd give them some advice and feedback, and sometimes have to remove them from the platform because we really want to keep such a high quality bar.
That's actually another question that we got prior to the session was, what criteria did you use to vet and kind of curate local partners? And how did you choose? And the thing that I don't think we have answered is, how did you choose and prioritize them in the search results?
Yeah, I think for the most part, most of our search results are heavily algorithmic based, like machine learning systems. And, it's a good thing in that our systems can learn quickly, what does well, what doesn't do well. But one of the downsides of that, and you see this in all kinds of platforms, is that it becomes very hard to explain to a host, what is it? Why is it that you're not the top of search results? Yeah. And the thing is that usually these machine learning programs are looking at about 30 to 50 attributes, and there's not one that really stands out. It's sort of an amalgamation of multiple. But for the most part, Airbnb is used algorithmic ranking. Then of course, we've also designed systems to do some amount of editorial where we hand pick things that we know will do well, or they have some kind of PR benefit. And we try to find a mix of the both. But I think the vast majority of how ranking works is algorithmic. But that's also, you can't really do that until you have critical mass. So like when you're getting started, you probably are going to be a bit more
Right.
hand curated, but as you get bigger, you can ship to more algorithmic.
Cool. Asif asks, how do you think your prior experiences in biotech and grad school contributed to your time at Airbnb? Are there any spaces that personally excite you for the future?
So I have never used synthetic biology at Airbnb. Just want to go on the record saying that. But the real value of a PhD program, in my mind, is, I had mentioned that the profile of the early employee, the early product manager, that seemed to work really well was, a former founder. And why did founders make such great product managers? Is because they had been able to create something almost out of nothing. And when you're a grad student, you're very alone, having to kind of create something out of nothing, or how to discover something all by yourself that no one's ever seen before, that can push the needle. And you have an advisor, but you don't get a lot of hand-holding to do that.
Right.
And I think it taught me to be comfortable with ambiguity. Secondly, I had that opportunity to learn. My PhD was a bit rare. I had the opportunity to build a consumer app, which taught me I like doing that. And so I'm thankful that my advisor let me do that. And three, especially the science PhD, you learn a lot about data and how to read data. And actually, I had to train myself when I moved from academia to Airbnb to not turn the PhD brain on, because when you're a PhD, you have years and years and years to get to the bottom of why is something acting a certain way. When you're in a company, a small company, you don't have that time. You don't have that data. You don't have the data either, right? Yeah, you have to just make a decision. And I had to train myself to not analyze data so deeply that it was unproductive. And so that's an example of something I had to unlearn from my PhD days.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think while if you just read it in black and white, it would seem like they're not connected at all. But I think the way you just described it, it absolutely lent itself to you being very successful at Airbnb. So often when we look back, we can connect the dots from all of our careers and education choices and figure out how it's molded us and shaped us to how we've gotten to where we are today. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. A couple more questions before we wrap up here. How can you recommend teams go about developing very early stages of product with limited technical resources? And I think a second question to that, or a related question, is what factors do you take into account when writing a roadmap that includes testing MVPs and early prototypes?
Yeah, so actually, can you repeat the first part of the question again?
Yeah, sorry, we're both working from home, so I'm trying to make sure you can't hear my partner in the background on this call. How can you recommend teams go about developing very early stages of product with limited technical resources?
So I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. And I think this question is relevant whether or not you are a seed stage company or you have a product team of 100 people. And that is that you will never have enough resources. And it's just Airbnb, when it was much bigger, struggled with this, and Airbnb when it was tiny, struggled with this. And so I think you have to accept that we're always going to be in a perpetual state of wanting to do more than you can actually do. And so I think the key thing, whether or not you are big or small, is to do things and test ideas as cheaply as possible, as quickly as possible. And that usually means not using engineering at first. And I think that lean startup methodologies have a thing called a concierge product. And I think you want to basically try. My first thing is always try it in spreadsheets first. Try to build a concierge version of the product. Try to validate the product without having to go to engineering, because engineering is extremely expensive no matter what size you are. And that kind of leads to the second part of your question, which is how do you balance that? And I would say whether or not you are running a company or whether or not you are running a product organization, you have to have ideally this balance between investing in things you know will be successful versus investing in what are the next things that will be successful. So you want to make sure, I'll throw a number out there, you can always change it, but how do you make sure 70% of your resources are going towards, if I put the investment in it, it's going to pay off? And how does 30% go towards, okay, 6 months from now, what do I want to be investing as my 70% cohort? Like, what are the next ideas that will take off? And if you go too much on just investing in things you know work, then you're going to one day hit a wall and not have the next thing. And if you only invest in the new ideas, then you don't ever really make any progress because a lot of them fail. And so you have to have that right balance. And the newer the idea is, the higher risk, the more you want to validate it more cheaply before going to something more expensive. And I took a software reliability class at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and they're the people that put the Mars rovers on Mars. And there's a diagram, I can never find it, but stuck in my head about, I always think about it, about like, what is the cost of changing something in the Mars rover once it's already on Mars versus what is the cost of an idea when it's just in your head or just on paper before it becomes the rover. And I think that you want to make as many mistakes, as much validation as possible before that robot gets on the planet. And because then it just becomes prohibitively expensive.
Right. Got it. Thank you. This was great. I feel like I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I would be absolutely remiss if I don't ask about your favorite Airbnb experience. This is just a fun question, but I mean, you created the thing. You got to tell us what should we be looking for on the platform when we're able to move about safely again?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love all
or virtually.
All my children. So I got this question a lot. It would depend on the city and everything, but there's one that I want to call out that they're also offering an online experience.
Nice.
And it's Luca and Lorenzo, and they do pasta making in Florence. And what I love about it is it explains the whole Airbnb journey, the whole journey of what Airbnb should be like. They pick you up from the train station with their tickets in hand. They bring you to this beautiful villa where you're making pasta the first time, and there's just gorgeous views. You're picking up eggs from the chickens, and you're having like the best meal at the end of it. And I left them feeling sad that I had like left a longtime friend, even though I had only met them like 4 hours earlier. Wow. And like, if you ever have a chance to get to Luca Lorenzo's villa outside of Florence, I highly recommend it. And then if you can't, do the online experience.
I like going to Florence and going a little bit outside for something else. There's a very big mall there, but this also sounds amazing. So maybe the next time I'm there, I can look this up.
For sure.
Well, thank you. Oh, someone has done this or has a friend who's done this and they really loved it. So you've already gotten like +1 on that. Cool. Well, thank you again for this conversation. I think I learned a lot about leadership. I learned a lot about building out a product org and how to be successful in that. And I hope that our founders and operators in the audience learned a lot too.
Hey, thank you so much. It was really fun.
Yes.
Turn it back over to Marion.
Yeah, appreciate all the learnings, all the gems. So thank you again, Joe and Racine. Such a pleasure to kind of listen in and learn so much. And then for those in the audience, we will be sending out a feedback survey. So please make sure to check your email. We always love to hear feedback, how we can improve, what else you would like to learn about. It's just helpful for us. And thank you again to you both, and have a great afternoon and day.
Thank you. Bye all.
Bye.